Recently, Occupy Democrats posted an unsourced, undetailed meme featuring a codependent quasi-celebutard named Brianna Tyler Cohen. It purported to say that red states have much higher homicide rates than blue states. Let's unpack, spindle, and mutilate these elementary school talking points. I should also mention, this wasn't part of my little script I did. Democrats are having autistic fits over assault weapons, so-called assault weapons, yet they're about 5.1% of all homicides. Handguns kill far more people in a given year. Personal weapons, hands, feet, and fists kill far more people in a year. And objects like a knife, crowbar, or a cinder block kill far more people. So that's just another, this will be another chink in their armor as far as they don't really know what they're talking about. Like I said, having autistic fits about assault weapons. Yeah, most of the homicide, the hood rat, gangland homicides in these Democrat-run cities, if a gun's involved, it's a handgun. So let's unpack this. See links in the video description. Wisconsin homicide rate 2018 to 2020 was 3.759 per 100,000. Milwaukee homicide rate for the same time frame was 21.996 per 100,000. Homicide rate in Wisconsin outside of Milwaukee 2018 to 2020, 1.724 per 100,000. Homicide rate in Wisconsin 2018 to 2020 in counties that voted 60% or more for Trump in 2016 to 2020. According to the Wisconsin State Department of Justice, that homicide rate was 1.473. So you can see the uber Trump counties are pulling down the homicide rate in Wisconsin, which is very low overall. The three Wisconsin counties that voted 60% or more for senile Biden and Hillary, their homicide rate from 2018 to 2020, 9.764 per 100,000. Again, most of that's because of Milwaukee City. But see, when you start segregating it by county. Illinois is a high homicide state as well, but you won't be surprised unless your name is Brianna Tyler Cohen and you were never trained to do actual research, but you can regurgitate pap from think tanks that just flush out nonsense all day. You will not be surprised that Illinois homicide problems are in two jurisdictions that overwhelmingly vote Democrat. Most counties in Illinois vote for Donald Trump, but Chicago and East St. Louis from 2018 to 2020 had a homicide rate of 23.391. The homicide rate in Illinois outside those two cities from 2018 to 2020, 3.105. That's way below the national average. Now, homicide rate in counties in Illinois that voted 60% or more for Trump twice, their homicide rate from 2018 to 2020 was 1.93 per 100,000. So even Brianna Tyler cohort or whatever her name is can do the math on that. Chicago has a lot of black homicide victims and a lot of black men arrested for homicide. You see what I'm getting at, kids? Just autistically repeating a state's homicide rate is only part of the story. Do you think all counties are homogenous? Same demographics, same violent crime rate, same homicide rate, and seeing who they sent their electoral votes to is all that matters. Only an uneducated person and or a person with a lot of free time would do that. Let me give you another example before we nuke Brianna's red state pablum. Pennsylvania is a high homicide state. But where are those homicides taking place and who is committing them? A mouth breather probably wouldn't ask, but I would presume most folks who have read all my essays on homicide and violent crime are not functionally retarded mouth breathers. So let's ask the tough questions. From 2018 to 2020, Pennsylvania had a homicide rate of 6.4 per 100,000, according to the FBI. That's slightly higher than the state police tally. Cumulative Pittsburgh and Philly homicide rate, two Democrat strongholds. From 2018 to 2020, Philly and Pittsburgh had a homicide rate of 23.767 per 100,000. Are you surprised most homicide victims in Philly and Pittsburgh are black males? Disproportionate. The homicide rate 2018 to 2020 for counties in Pennsylvania that voted 60% or more for Trump twice. Their homicide rate from 2018 to 2020, 2.85 per 100,000. It's the Democrat strongholds that are causing Pennsylvania's homicide rates to spike, not the uber-white pro-Trump counties. I would accuse Brianna Tyler cohort of sloppy research, but she did no research. She just regurgitated a study that has been passed around every regressive outlet like a bong at a frat party. Now let's get to some solid red states. For you historians out there who don't believe time began in 2000, remember Ronald Reagan's Sea of Blue in 1984? Tennessee is a high homicide state, but who is committing these crimes and where? There are 2 counties in Tennessee that consistently vote Democrat in the 60+% range, Shelby and Davidson. From 2018 to 2020, they had a homicide rate of 19.882 per 100,000. Tennessee's homicide rate outside of Shelby and Davidson counties in that same time frame, 4.318 per 100,000. In the 3 years I looked at arrests by race for Group A offenses in Tennessee, which includes a laundry list of offenses, in those 2 years, blacks were more than 50% of the arrestees, and in the other year, they were close to 50% of the arrestees. Most of that is Davidson and Shelby counties. Tennessee is only 17.1% black. Whites are 4 times the population of blacks. A little more, actually. According to the FBI, South Carolina had a homicide rate 2018 to 2020 of 9.066 per 100,000. That's very high. Again, where are these taking place and who's perpetrating them? The counties in South Carolina that voted 60% or more for Biden and Hillary had a homicide rate of 14.491 per 100,000 from 2018 to 2020. The counties that voted twice for Donald Trump 60% or more had a homicide rate of 6.803 per 100,000 from 2018 to 2020. Brianna and her sheep might say, aha, very pro-Trump counties that have a homicide rate well above the national average. Hold on, Cletus. There's more. In 2018 to 2020, of the 1,118 arrestees for criminal homicide in South Carolina, an eye-popping 844, or 75.49% of them were, guess what, black. This record has been playing a loop for several decades. Time for a new one. South Carolina, keep in mind, South Carolina is only 27% black. Arkansas is another red state with a high homicide rate. Let's do them too. Since Trump won Arkansas by such massive margins, I will tally the homicide rate for counties he won 66% or more of the vote, and let's see what we end up with. Those counties from 2018 to 2020 had a homicide rate of 4.583 per 100,000. That's lower than the national average for that time frame. Homicide rate in these Democrat strongholds: North Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and Little Rock, 24.931 per 100,000 from 2018 to 2020. Criminal homicide rate in Arkansas outside of North Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and Little Rock equals 6.751 per 100,000 according to the FBI, and 6.591 according to state data per 100,000. There's a whole bunch of arrestees. I can go over this quickly. In 2020, 2/3 of the arrestees for homicide in Arkansas were black. In 2019, 68.48% of the arrestees for homicide in Arkansas were black. And in 2018, 2/3, more than 2/3, a little over 2/3 of the arrestees for homicide in Arkansas were black. And Arkansas is only 15.7% black. Stick that in your pipe and poof it, little man. I have a lot more information. I'm not going to cover it all because I would be here for another hour, and I have better things to do than correct emasculated soy boys who will never sniff a real job. Let's look at Missouri, another red state with a sky-high homicide rate. Homicide rate in St. Louis City and Kansas City from 2018 to 2020, 45.995 per 100,000. Holy crap. Criminal homicide rate in Missouri outside of St. Louis City and Kansas City, the FBI says it's 4.923, and Missouri Highway Patrol says it's 5.010. A little high, but still lower than the national average. What was the homicide rate for 2018 to 2020 in Missouri counties that voted 66% or more, since Trump won Missouri so massively and bigly? What was the homicide rate 2018 to 2020 in Missouri counties that voted 66% or more for Trump in 2016 and 2020? 1.814 per 100,000. That is much lower than the homicide rate in Missouri outside of St. Louis City and Kansas City. The uber Republican, uber white Donald Trump counties in Missouri are not spiking homicide there. I could go on and on. Minnesota is a very low homicide state, but the Twin Cities are the problem children there, and you know who they vote for. The homicide rate in Minnesota in counties that Trump won 60% or more of the vote in 2 presidential elections, their homicide rate's well below the Minnesota average, which is really low. Iowa's another low homicide state, especially if you calculate the average outside of Des Moines and Davenport. Now, Des Moines and Davenport have a homicide rate collectively much higher than the national average, Stick that in your pipe and poof it. From 2008 to 2019, blacks averaged 37.99% of the arrestees for violent crime. If we assume, and not gratuitously, that black men are 75% of the black arrestees for violent crime, men are typically 75% of those arrested for violent crime, then that means black men only were 28.53%. 28.53% of all arrestees for violent crime 2008 to 2019. Black men are 6.6% of the population. Of the 105,907 arrestees for murder / non-negligent manslaughter 2008 to 2019, and typically a little over 80% of those people arrested for murder in the U.S. are men. Of those 105,970 arrestees, 54,063, or 51.01% of the arrestees were black. And if we assume, not gratuitously, that 80% of the black arrestees for murder are black men, since, again, 80% of the arrestees typically are men, did you know that black men are 6.6% of the population, but from 2008 to 2019, they were 40.81%, or 43,250 of all the arrests for murder / non-negligent manslaughter in the U.S. From 2008 to 2020, black men were 43.866% of all homicide victims, where the FBI had expanded data giving us the race and gender of the victim. Again, black men are 6.6% of the population. Contrast that with Asians. Asians were 4.8% of the population in 2010, 5.9% in 2020. From 2008 to 2020, why are Asians doing so good and blacks struggling? They're a minority. Maybe it's a culture thing. From 2008 to 2020, Asians averaged 1.357% of all the arrestees for violent crime. Of the 114,588 arrestees for murder 2008 to 2020, 1.15% of the arrestees were Asian. How come Asians are arrested for violent crimes at a much lower rate volume than blacks? How come? If Brianna Tyler Cohen had examined homicide data by county, which he would not, because that would take a lot of work and he is not capable of performing that. If Byron had looked at homicide rates by county, he would have had a much different conclusion. If he had looked at homicide rates and voting preferences by county, only taking counties where the winner got 60% of the vote or more, he would have had a much different conclusion. I should also mention, if you win a state by a few thousand votes and nobody gets 50% of the vote, you can't really say it was an overwhelming victory. Every presidential election, there are a few of those, unless it is a Ronald Reagan, Nixon, or LBJ type blowout. Brianna Tyler Cohen is an idiot. Do not take the little man seriously. See the links in the video description. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.